I'm Marissa Sura. I'll be moderating this panel. I work for the university and university relations. I'm the director of research communications, and I've had the great pleasure of working very closely with these guys over the last year and a half to help talk about all the wonderful things that they've been doing to a global audience. And we've gotten a lot of requests to hear their story. So with me, I have Dan Carter, who is the director of the center. He's been with CAFEE since its inception, some 25 years ago. Arvind Thiruvengadam, who is an assistant professor in the College of Engineering. Mark Besh, who's a research assistant professor. And Saroj Pradham, who is a graduate student getting his Ph.D. In engineering. And Daniel Lund, who was an undergraduate student who worked at the lab and who graduated last spring and is now working at the lab. So I know probably everybody in this room has heard the great story of the work that these guys did that sparked one of the biggest automotive scandals in history. So what they did was, in the fall of 2015, the Environmental Protection Agency and the California Air Resources Board filed claims against Volkswagen that they had cheated on emissions tests. And these guys did the study that sort of sparked that investigation and ended up having those agencies find out from Volkswagen that they had cheated on those tests. So we hope today to give you a little bit of insight on the work that they did to start that off, and then also the work that they continue to do and the work that they hope to do in the future to leverage this opportunity. So I'm going to start with a question that's going to bust one of the myths that we always hear, and that is that when you did the study, that you set out to prove that diesel technology was not a viable option.
Yeah, that was probably the most heard misconception, at least at first when the media cycle started. I think it was easy for the media to try to find the whistleblower, and that's really not what we were doing. We've worked in the industry, heavy-duty diesel emissions, particularly for over 25 years. We actually were made aware of the study through one of the instrument manufacturers that we work with quite directly, Hariba Instruments. And we responded to an RFP that the International Council on Clean Transportation, ICCT, had issued. So our kind of impetus was to look at light-duty passenger car vehicles and to understand how they were controlling emissions, more so the strategies that they use and how that relates to fuel economy and to consumption of some of the chemicals that are used to control emissions, and how we might translate that over into the heavy industry. So it was really trying to help promote that clean diesel technology and light-duty passenger car was an option. We know that the challenges of greenhouse gas are there. And in order to bring that technology to light to the rest of the consumers in the market, that diesels were a really good option.
So I know that you in CAFEE, you're all from the Statler College, and you've been working in energy and alternative fuels for a long time, but you hadn't done much light duty work. You've done a lot of heavy duty, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So traditionally, we did heavy duty for the entire time the center has been in place, and that was really the interest of this study, is to look at light duty vehicles for kind of like the first time really on the road, how they perform, because we have our experience from the heavy duty side, knowing how tractors operate, the challenges they face in terms of cleaning up their emissions, and looking at light duty, there are different set of requirements that need to be met, different operating conditions. A vehicle is being driven in a city, completely different than an over-the-road tractor. And so it was interesting to see what did the light-duty industry do to actually address these emissions and look at how the performance of these vehicles is in terms of cleaning up emissions and in terms of fuel economy.
So Mark, you and Arvind were the ones that drove hours and hours and hours in these vehicles on the road in California. Can you talk just a little bit about talk about how the way you're driving affects the emissions and how you were measuring that? I have this nice picture here of how you were measuring that.
So yes, the picture at the back is the portable emissions measurement system, as we call it. It's like it's a shoebox size instrument that would give us a pretty accurate estimate of the pollutants that are coming from the tailpipe. And as you can see, it can fit into the trunk of a vehicle. And actually, the irony of the study was also that initially when we set out, we picked European vehicles because ICCT was trying to see the difference in manufacturer strategy when they're making a vehicle for the U.S. as opposed to making a car in the Europe, because U.S. has a much more stringent emissions regulation. So that's why we were focusing on European diesel vehicles. And then we chose the routes in such a way, because the project was also, was not a high research dollar amount, it was $60,000. And we were already in California doing a huge project for California Air Resources Board. So we thought, it was easier to share resources. So we moved our entire project to the West Coast in California. And also, California driving conditions, poses a different kind of challenge in terms of traffic density and such. So it made more sense so that we are testing these vehicles to its limits in terms of its emissions reduction potential. So we chose routes that were predominantly based in downtown LA. We chose a route that went to San Diego. And then a part of the proposal, we had proposed that we were going to drive, initially we proposed that we were going to drive a vehicle from Morgantown to California, so do a cross country. But as the study unfolded, logistics changed, so we said, okay, we still have to keep the deliverable, of course. So we said we're going to drive from Los Angeles to Seattle and back, and that was a brutal drive with no space in the car, and we had equipment and everything that was occupying, so we couldn't recline our seats, so it was pretty much like this for 24 hours.
Yeah, and people always ask us, what did you listen to in the car?
We listened to that, the genset, and a loud compressor that was there.
Yeah.
Inside.
For how many hours?
For more than 30 hours.
That's a lot. So,
but I mean, that looks like a safety concern, but we made sure the exhaust didn't come back into the car.
Yeah, so that's another thing. So what were other drivers looking? They were probably looking at you like, what is happening with this car?
I mean, I think in LA they're probably used to this kind of craziness. So LA we didn't. In LA we didn't get too much attention, but we did have our share of the rest areas. People would think that we are making fuel out of exhaust. That was mostly, they would ask what kind of fuel we are making out of the exhaust, because see this contraption.
Yeah, because they see that the exhaust is partially routed back into the vehicle, so they thought, okay, we are taking some of the unburned fuel that comes out of the exhaust to some regenerative technology that helps us propelling the vehicle, and using some of the exhaust to actually harvest that. And I think a few times he stopped at red lights, and so vehicles will be pulling up parallel on the other lane and pulling their windows down and asking what we are doing or what we are actually measuring. So.
But never stopped by police, never. That was strange.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So can you talk a little bit about what actually is happening in this picture and how, so obviously the exhaust is coming from the tailpipe into this tubing, then it goes into the analyzer. So what exactly is it measuring in the exhaust?
So if you look at the bottom, the very big tube on the bottom is where the exhaust is getting routed to, and in the middle part you see an extraction point where exhaust is then extracted, a certain amount of a portion of it, and routed into the instrument in the left side, where we measure gaseous emissions, including NOx, which is the critical emission for diesel engines, and CO2 in order to calculate greenhouse gas emissions. But it also measures CO and hydrocarbons, total hydrocarbons. And then additionally, we measure particulate matter, which is another instrument which is behind the generator, which you see on the right side. So it's like a little bit hidden behind, to look at particulate matter emissions, the second critical emission part from diesel engines.
So what happened with Volkswagen is that, Mark, you were in the lab, the test cell with this vehicle, and here I have another picture. In something like this. This is actually the lab, this is CAFEE's lab in Morgantown, but you were in a lab in California with the Air Resources Board. on this light-duty chassis dynamometer, which is basically like a treadmill for cars, right? So you were testing emissions in the lab, and Arvind had tested some on the road as well. And what was the phone call like when you talked to each other and discovered there was something different happening in the lab versus on the road?
Well, I mean, Mark and I are always in touch when there's a program going on. So Mark was in California doing the work with California Air Resources Board with a light-duty dyno. And then, I would just ask for updates, and he would say, it's as we expected. These vehicles are highly efficient in emissions reduction, and we see near zero. And we knew the technology that these vehicles were using, so it wasn't a surprise. I mean, we see this often in heavy-duty vehicles. Right now they are ultra clean. I mean, if there are conducive conditions for these technologies to work, they are very, very clean. So it was kind of expected, and then but when I would join him for the on-road work where we started driving in California, and I would ask him, I'm like, we don't see this trend that you're seeing, this near zero trend. I mean, are we doing something wrong? So that was the point where we realized that what Mark was seeing in the lab was different from what we're observing on the road.
So you've told me before that when you notice something different, because you're scientists, the first thing you thought was you screwed up, right? That your data was wrong. So you checked and rechecked the equipment, and